The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, jagged vibration that never quite stopped. It was the sound of a place where time did not move, but merely accumulated. Every surface in the waiting room was hard, cold, and polished to a dull shine. The air tasted of sterile chemicals and stale coffee. A clock on the far wall ticked with an uneven, rhythmic stutter, dragging seconds into minutes that refused to pass. Outside, the world was turning, but in here, the only motion was the flicker of a loose bulb and the occasional,
sharp intake of breath from someone sitting in the shadows. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, pressing against the chest, demanding attention. It was a vacuum where anxiety grew, fed by the uncertainty of what lay behind the double doors at the end of the hall. No one spoke. No one looked up. Every person in that room was anchored to a single, unspoken fear, waiting for a piece of news that would either break them or set them free.
The stillness held them all in a common, suffocating grip. Across the aisle sat a man, Thomas Hale, his hands folded tight in his lap. He stared at the floor, counting the scuffs on his boots to keep his mind from drifting toward the double doors. 11 feet away sat a woman, Linda Coleman. She looked smaller than she was, tucked into the corner of the plastic chairs. They were two islands in a sea of clinical white,
each nursing a private storm,
entirely unaware that the trajectory of their lives was currently locked in a collision course. Thomas shifted, the movement drawing a sharp, metallic creak from his chair. Linda did not look up, but her posture stiffened. She tightened her grip on the device in her palm until her knuckles turned pale. The space between them felt charged, a narrow bridge of linoleum floor that neither had yet dared to cross. He looked at her, then away, checking the clock again. The distance felt absolute. Yet, in this room of stalled lives, the proximity was a fuse, burning down toward a moment that would eventually unravel the future for them both. The silence shattered. It started with the sharp, plastic click of a phone being dialed.
Linda Coleman leaned forward, her shoulders hunched as if shielding herself from a blow. She pressed the receiver to her ear, her other hand trembling so violently that the cord rattled against the chair. Her voice emerged as a ragged, thin thread, barely audible above the hum of the overhead lights. "Please," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. She closed her eyes, her head bowing low until her chin touched her chest. "There has to be another way. I have tried everything. Just give me more time." She pulled the phone tighter, her knuckles straining against the casing. Her breath hitched, turning into a jagged, uneven rhythm that betrayed a total collapse of composure.
She wasn't asking. She was pleading with a void that offered no mercy. Across the aisle, Thomas watched her. He saw the way her fingers dug into the fabric of her skirt, the way she shook her head in silent, repeated denial as the voice on the other end spoke. The raw, unfiltered desperation radiating from her cut through the clinical coldness of the room, pulling his gaze toward her with the force of a physical weight.
The line went dead. Linda lowered the phone, her hand dropping to her lap like a stone.
She stared at a stack of brochures on the empty chair beside her diagrams of a human heart, the valves marked in red ink.
8 years old. That was all the time Grace had been given. A congenital defect.
The doctors called it, a structural failure in the very engine of life. The words on the bank letters were cold,
printed in crisp, black type. Application denied. She had folded those letters until the paper tore at the creases. Every door in the city had slammed shut in her face. The specialists were miles away. The surgery cost a fortune she did not possess, and the clock was not just ticking, it was accelerating. She smoothed the crumpled edges of the bank statement, her thumb tracing the zero balance. There was no more time to beg, no more credit to exhaust, and no more sympathy to be found in the ledger of a bank manager. She sat motionless, the weight of the impossible decision pressing down on her shoulders.
The fluorescent lights buzzed, indifferent to the fact that a life was expiring in a room across town.
While here, in this chair, the final option had officially run out.
Thomas stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked to the vending machine at the far end of the hall, the rhythmic clink of coins echoing against the tile floor. He returned with 2 paper cups, steam curling into the stale air. He stopped 11 feet from her, then took the final steps to stand directly in her line of sight. He held out 1 cup. Linda did not look up at first.
Her eyes remained locked on the floor, red-rimmed and hollow. When she finally raised her head, she recoiled slightly, her muscles tensing as if expecting another rejection. Thomas did not pull back.
He kept his arm extended, holding the cup steady until her fingers, cold and trembling, brushed against his.
She took it. The warmth seemed to startle her, drawing a sharp, ragged intake of breath.
She gripped the cup, letting the heat seep into her palms. Thomas sat in the chair next to hers, not crowding.
Just present. He looked at the wall, giving her the space to remain silent. She looked at the steam, then back at him. Her lips parted. The story came out in a rush, the diagnosis, the surgery, the impossible cost, the closed doors of every bank in the city. She spoke until the coffee went cold.
Thomas walked out into the cool night air, the hospital doors swinging shut behind him with a heavy, final thud. The city street was quiet, dampened by a light mist that clung to the asphalt.
He kept his hands deep in his pockets, his pace steady, but his focus was fractured. The image of the mother sitting in that chair, her voice cracking as she described the heart defect,
played on a loop in his mind. He tried to count the streetlights, tried to think of his shift at the warehouse the next day.
But the face of the child Grace kept surfacing. He imagined her in a bed, smaller than the ones he saw in the ward, struggling for every breath. He reached his car,
a rusted sedan that rattled with every turn of the engine. He sat in the driver's seat,
the smell of damp upholstery thick in the small cabin. He turned the key. The starter groaned, sputtered, and died. He tried again. Silence. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, staring out at the dark road ahead.
There was no escaping the weight of what he had heard. He realized he was no longer just a warehouse worker heading home. He was now the only bridge between a child and the morning light.
Inside his apartment, the silence was absolute. Thomas went to the small metal lockbox hidden beneath his bed.
He pulled it out, the metal scraping against the floorboards. Inside, tucked under a stack of utility bills, lay a weathered passbook. He opened it to the final page. The numbers were clear, written in firm, black ink, 4 years of extra shifts, overtime pay, and missed weekends. It was enough for a reliable truck, one that wouldn't stall at intersections or leave him stranded in the rain. He traced the final balance with his thumb, the paper worn thin at the edges. He looked at the window, where the streetlight cast a long, pale bar across the room. The image of the child in the hospital bed returned, sharper than before. He looked back at the passbook, then at the empty space where a new truck should have been. He picked up a pen, hovered it over the numbers, and set it back down. The math no longer mattered. The truck was a convenience, but the life he had heard about in that waiting room was a necessity. He closed the book. The decision was not a struggle. It was a realization that settled into his bones. The morning air was sharp as Thomas pushed through the hospital's sliding doors. He navigated the sterile hallway, his boots echoing against the linoleum. He reached the billing office window, a small glass barrier separating him from the rest of the world. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes and a stack of files, looked up. Thomas placed the passbook on the counter. He pushed it forward, his hand steady. She opened it, scanned the figures, and looked at him with sudden, sharp confusion. She asked for his identification, for a reason, for a name to put on the donor line. Thomas shook his head.
He leaned in, his voice low and firm. "Keep the record blank," he said. "No name, no credit. Just apply it to the file for the surgery." She hesitated, her pen hovering over the ledger.
He stood his ground, a man who had already spent his future. She finally nodded, stamped the receipt, and slid the empty passbook back. Thomas turned away, the weight of the last 4 years gone. He walked out of the building into the rising sun. He had no truck. He had no savings. He had nothing left to give, and yet he felt the rhythm of his own pulse with a clarity he had never known before. The hospital floor felt cold underfoot as the hours ticked by. Behind the double doors, the monitors hummed, a rhythmic pulse that dictated the pace of the room. Linda sat in the corner of the waiting area,
her fingers gripping a plastic cup until her knuckles turned white. Every time a door opened,
she surged forward, only to pull back when a nurse hurried past. Then, the silence finally broke.
A surgeon stepped out, removing a mask to reveal a tired, professional smile. The surgery had worked. The defect was repaired. Grace was breathing on her own. The relief was a physical weight.
Pulling Linda down into the chair, she reached into her bag, found a scrap of paper and a pen,
and rested her hand against the cold laminate tabletop. She had no name to address,
no face to visualize, only the reality of her daughter's continued life. She wrote the words carefully.
The ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper, she addressed the note to "My Angel,"
detailing the miracle of a second chance. She folded it, tucked it into the back of her Bible, and closed the cover. The mystery had begun, an invisible thread connecting a stranger to a life he would never see. The engine of his car coughed once, shuddered, and died in the middle of a rain-slicked intersection. Thomas sat behind the wheel for a long moment, listening to the silence of the cooling metal. He turned the key. Only a hollow click answered. He stepped out into the drizzle, pushed the vehicle to the shoulder, and left it there. He began the walk home. It was 3 miles, and it was the first of many. Over the next year, the distance became his new rhythm. He mapped the city not by street names, but by the incline of hills and the texture of the pavement under his boots. His budget shrank to the barest essentials.
He skipped meals, turned off the heat in winter,
and worked longer shifts at the warehouse to keep his head above water. There were days when the wind bit through his layers and the fatigue settled deep into his bones. Yet, he never felt the sting of loss. Every step he took was a trade he had made willingly.
He saw children playing in the parks, heard laughter in the streets,
and knew that somewhere, another life was unfolding because of the void he had left in his own bank account. He kept his head down, focused on the path, and never once looked back at the road he had abandoned. Time moved forward in a blur of textbooks and hospital shifts. Grace grew with a singular purpose, her life anchored by the knowledge of a debt she could never name. She stood in operating theaters for 18 hours at a time, her hands steady as she manipulated tiny valves and repaired scarred tissue. She became an expert in pediatric cardiology, known for a focus that bordered on obsessive. Every time she closed a chest, she searched the faces of the families waiting in the hall, looking for a sign, a flicker of recognition, or a ghost from her childhood. She spent her nights scouring old hospital archives, tracing faded signatures on financial records, and cross-referencing patient logs from decades prior. The mystery was a weight she carried into every room. She kept her mother's Bible on her desk, the worn leather cracked from constant handling.
Whenever she felt the exhaustion of the job, she would open it to the page where the yellowed letter remained.
She was no longer just a survivor. She was a hunter of the truth. She worked with the quiet intensity of someone trying to solve the riddle of her own existence, convinced that if she found the man who once gave everything to save her, the cycle of her life would finally be complete.
The warehouse doors were locked for the final time on a Tuesday. The silence left behind was heavy,
settling into the vast, empty aisles where forklifts once hummed. Thomas spent his final day clearing his locker, his movements slower than they had been in years. He walked toward the exit,
his hand pressed against his side, trying to steady a sudden, rhythmic thumping in his chest.
It was not the exertion of the work, but a sharp, biting pressure that radiated down his left arm. He paused by the loading dock.
Leaning against the cold, corrugated metal until the flare of pain subsided, he breathed,
waiting for his pulse to return to its normal, sluggish pace. He had spent his life keeping his head down and his needs quiet.
But now his own body was refusing to follow that rule. He stepped out into the parking lot,
the evening air sharp against his face. He reached into his pocket,
his fingers brushing against a worn, empty wallet. He looked back at the darkened building, then at the empty road ahead.
The irony was a cold weight in his gut. He was facing a wall of his own,
a medical reality he could no longer ignore, and for the first time in his life, he had absolutely nothing left to trade.
The white envelope sat on the kitchen table, a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper.
Thomas pulled the single sheet of paper from inside. The numbers were precise, printed in bold black ink that seemed to mock the emptiness of his bank account. It was a formal demand for payment, a total that exceeded his lifetime of savings. He pushed the paper away, his fingers trembling, and looked toward the window. The streetlights outside cast long,
thin shadows across the floor, echoing the lonely light of the hospital waiting room from decades before. He stood, walked to the cabinet, and opened the empty tin where he once kept his spare coins.
Nothing remained. He sat back down, the silence of the room amplifying the rhythm of his own erratic heartbeat. He remembered the look on the woman's face all those years ago, the way she clutched her phone, the way she begged for a lifeline that didn't exist. He had been the one to provide it then. Now, the roles had shifted.
Yet the outcome felt identical. He folded the bill, tucked it back into the envelope,
and stared at the ceiling. The math was simple, the conclusion inevitable. He was standing in the same trapped space he had once helped another person escape, and this time there was no one left to offer him a cup of coffee.
Grace worked through the afternoon, surrounded by stacks of cardboard boxes in the quiet attic. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant paper and cedar. She lifted a heavy, leather-bound Bible from the bottom of a crate, its edges frayed from years of heavy use. As she set it on the floor, the book fell open to a middle page. A folded, yellowed piece of stationery slipped out, fluttering down to rest on the floorboards. She picked it up, her pulse quickening as she unfolded the brittle edges.
The handwriting was her mother's, shaky but deliberate, addressed to my angel. Grace read the words. The ink faded by time, but the gratitude still sharp. It was the letter her mother had written after the surgery that had saved her life.
She looked at the signature, then back at the date written at the top. The mystery of her survival, which she had pushed to the back of her mind during her surgical training,
surged forward with renewed force. She held the paper against her chest, the weight of the past pressing into her palms.
The donor had been a ghost for 25 years, but in this moment, the silence of the attic felt less like an ending and more like a starting point for a search that was long overdue. Grace spent the next 2 years dissecting the past. She contacted every billing department that had existed in the city 3 decades prior.
Most calls ended in curt refusals or dead-end archives.
She spent weekends in public libraries, scouring microfiche records until her eyes burned.
Every lead turned into a wall of privacy laws and shredded documents. Her resolve hardened.
She shifted her focus to the personnel who had worked the night shift in the hospital wing that Tuesday. She tracked down a former nurse, then a receptionist, until she reached a retired administrator living in a quiet suburban home.
The man was frail, his memory clouded by age, but he kept a trunk of old office logs in his garage.
Grace sat on a folding chair in the damp space, watching as he pried open the heavy wooden lid. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, the spine cracked and stained. He blew off a thick layer of gray dust, the particles dancing in the sliver of sunlight cutting through the garage door. He flipped through pages of yellowed paper, his finger tracing columns of names and dates. His hand stopped midway down a page from 25 years ago.
He looked up at Grace and tapped the entry. The search had finally reached its end.
Grace leaned in, her breath hitching as her eyes locked onto the entry. The ink was dark,
preserved perfectly against the amber hue of the paper. Thomas Hale. Beside the name,
a transaction date matched the night of her mother's desperate wait. She traced the letters with her fingertip,
the reality of the name vibrating through her. It was not a ghost or a myth. It was a man, a warehouse worker, a stranger who had walked into a hospital and changed the trajectory of her entire existence. The administrator pointed to an old address recorded in the margin. Grace pulled a pen from her bag and copied the information onto a notepad, her hand shaking with a sudden, sharp clarity. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor.
The quiet garage suddenly felt too small for the magnitude of what she held in her hand. She thanked the man,
her voice thick, and stepped out into the daylight. She did not drive home. She turned her car toward the address on the pad, the map unfolding in her mind. The 2-year search had narrowed down to a single street, a single door, and the man who had traded his own future for hers. Grace pulled up to a weathered bungalow on the edge of the city. The lawn was overgrown, and the paint on the siding was flaking away in long, gray ribbons. She sat in her car for a long minute, watching the house. It looked as tired as the man she had spent years searching for. She stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel drive. Each step toward the porch felt like walking through the history of her own life.
She reached the door and paused, her knuckles hovering just inches from the wood.
She knocked. 3 sharp, deliberate strikes. The sound echoed into the stillness of the street. Silence followed. She knocked again, louder this time. A few seconds passed, then the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back groaned from within. The door swung open slowly. Thomas stood in the threshold, leaning heavily against the frame. He was thin, his shoulders hunched, and his movements were jagged and slow. He looked at Grace with eyes that seemed to struggle to focus. A faint, weary confusion etched into the lines of his face. The distance between them was only a few inches, but it felt as if she were staring across 25 years of silence. Grace stepped into the dim hallway, the air smelling of dust and stale coffee. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. Thomas watched her,
his hand trembling as he gripped the doorframe for support. She unfolded the letter, the paper crackling in the absolute silence of the room. She began to read. Her voice started as a soft, steady hum, reciting the words her mother had penned a quarter-century ago. "My angel," she read, the title hanging in the air like a prayer. As she spoke of the hospital night and the desperation of a mother facing the loss of her child, Thomas leaned back, his eyes fixed on the floor. His breathing hitched, shallow and ragged. Grace continued, detailing the gratitude that had lived inside their family for decades. When she reached the final line,
the silence that followed was absolute. Thomas looked up, his eyes glassy and brimming with moisture.
A single tear traced a path through the deep lines on his cheek. He did not speak, but his shoulders slumped, the tension of 25 years of solitude finally giving way to the reality of being seen. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of a calloused hand and shook his head. He gestured vaguely toward the window, as if trying to push the memory out of the house. It was just a Tuesday. "Grace," he whispered, his voice raspy, "I had a few dollars, and you were a child who needed a chance."
Anyone would have done the same. Grace did not pull away. She stepped closer, placing a hand on the small wooden table that separated them. She looked at him, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "No," she said, her voice firm. "People did not do the same. They turned their backs. They closed their doors. You gave me a lifetime." She reached out, covering his hand with hers. The contrast between her steady, surgeon's grip and his thin, shaking fingers was stark. "You saved me," she added, the weight of her entire career resting on those 3 words. Thomas looked at her, searching her face, perhaps seeing the child he had never met, now fully grown and breathing before him. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the realization that a single, quiet choice had bridged 25 years of time. Grace did not let go of his hand. She felt the erratic rhythm of his pulse, too fast, then skipping. The color of his skin was pale, almost translucent under the dim light. She stood up, her movements precise and practiced, and walked to the kitchen counter where a stack of envelopes lay.
She flipped through them. Final notices. Unpaid surgical consultations.
A diagnosis of severe cardiac failure that had been sitting on the table for months. She turned back to him,
her expression hardening into the look she wore in the operating theater. She saw a man who had given his life for hers,
now waiting to die in the same silence he had chosen decades ago. "You are not doing this alone,"
she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She grabbed her phone, dialed her administrator, and began listing requirements for an immediate admission. Thomas tried to protest, but she held up a hand, silencing him. She was moving with the momentum of a debt that had finally come due. She walked back to his side, pulled a chair close, and began documenting his current symptoms. She was the surgeon now, and he was the patient who would finally receive the care he had bought for the world. Grace hung up the phone, the clinical finality of the arrangements echoing in the small room. She looked at Thomas, who sat exhausted, his breath shallow. Without a word, she began the transition. She scrubbed her own hands with a sharp, rhythmic intensity that signaled a shift in her focus. When she walked into the hospital corridors, she was no longer a visitor. She was the architect of his survival. She bypassed the standard surgical rotations, signing herself as the lead surgeon on the case. The administrative staff hesitated, but she pushed the file forward, her signature a mark of absolute authority. She entered the prep room, the smell of antiseptic sharp against her senses. She watched the nurses prepare the monitors. She checked the equipment herself, testing the suction and the flow of the bypass machine. Every movement was a mirror of her years of training, a skill set built on the foundation of the heart he had saved so long ago. She pulled on her sterile gloves, the snap of the latex sounding like a final command. She turned toward the theater doors, ready to mend the very heart that had once made her own life possible. The operating table was cold beneath him. Thomas stared up at the bright, circular lights that seemed to pulse in time with his own failing heart. He felt the sting of the IV needle in his arm, and the slow, creeping numbness that began to spread through his limbs. He turned his head. Grace was standing just to his right, adjusting her mask, her eyes focused on the monitors. She sensed his gaze and looked down. In that moment, the sterile hum of the machines seemed to vanish. There was no surgeon, no patient, only the 2 people who had sat 11 feet apart in a hospital waiting room 25 years ago. Her eyes were steady, reflecting a depth of gratitude that words could never hold. He saw the child he had saved now standing as the master of his own survival. He did not feel fear. He felt a quiet, absolute certainty. He blinked slowly, a small, tired movement that spoke volumes. Grace stepped closer, her hand briefly touching his shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. She leaned in, her eyes locking onto his one last time before the world began to blur. He held that look, trusting the hands that were about to open him to the world he had given her. The monitors began their steady, rhythmic beep, signaling that Thomas was fully under. Grace stood perfectly still. The room felt suddenly vast, the silence heavy with the gravity of the work ahead. She took one long, slow breath, exhaling until her lungs were empty, grounding the tremor in her fingers. She reached out, her hand closing around the scalpel with practiced, cold precision. The metal felt like an extension of her own will. She leaned forward, the light reflecting off the steel blade as it hovered for a fraction of a second above the mark. She lowered her hand. The first incision was clean, decisive, and deep. Blood appeared, and she moved with instant, fluid efficiency, her hands working to clear the field. Every movement was calculated to minimize damage and maximize control. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, steady hum of the bypass pumps. She was no longer a person in a room. She was a conduit for the life he had granted her decades ago. She ignored the ache in her shoulders and the sweat stinging her eyes. She focused only on the tissue, the vessels, and the rhythm of the heart that needed to be mended before the clock ran out.
The rhythm broke. A sharp, high-pitched alarm tore through the sterile focus of the room. Blood welled up, obscuring the field, pulsating with a speed that signaled a severed vessel deep within the cavity. Grace froze for a heartbeat, her eyes widening as the monitor displayed a jagged downward trend in his pressure. "Suction! Now!" she commanded, her voice sharp and devoid of hesitation. She dove in with the clamps, her fingers moving with frantic, desperate speed. The suction gurgled. Struggling to clear the red haze that threatened to hide the source of the leak, Thomas's heart monitor switched to a rapid, erratic staccato. The anesthesia team shouted updates, their voices tight with mounting alarm. Grace ignored the noise. She pressed her gauze into the dark cavity, her hands shaking from the sudden surge of adrenaline. She found the vessel, but it was fragile, tearing further under the pressure of her instruments. Every second that ticked by felt like an hour. His blood pressure bottomed out. The monitor flatlined into a long, continuous tone that vibrated in the air. The room felt like it was closing in. She took a breath, ignored the scream of the machine, and drove the needle into the tissue.
The needle passed through the tissue, pulling the edges of the vessel together.
Grace tied the knot with surgical precision and withdrew her hands. For 3 seconds, the room remained silent, save for the hum of the ventilation system.
The monitor emitted only the flat, unrelenting tone. Then, a single,
weak electrical spark flickered across the screen. A tiny, stuttering movement occurred within the chest cavity. Grace held her breath,
her eyes locked onto the monitor. Another twitch followed, stronger this time. Then came a distinct,
rhythmic thud. The monitor registered a pulse, slow and irregular, but alive. The continuous tone ceased,
replaced by the steady, mechanical cadence of a recovering heart. The entire surgical team exhaled in unison.
Grace felt the tension drain from her shoulders, leaving her hands trembling. She checked the pressure readings. They were climbing.
Slowly returning to a stable range, she stepped back from the table,
wiping the condensation from her forehead with her forearm. "He is stable," she announced, her voice rasping with exhaustion.
She watched the green line trace its path across the display, a steady mountain range of peaks and valleys.
The crisis had passed. The heart was beating again, strong and rhythmic, signaling that the procedure was a success.
The heavy fog of anesthesia receded in jagged waves. Thomas felt the weight of the hospital sheets against his chest, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator beside his bed, and a dull, throbbing ache that anchored him to the present. He tried to lift his hand, but it felt like lead. His eyelids fluttered, struggling against the harsh, artificial light that filtered through the room. The world was a blur of white surfaces and metallic shadows. Then, a face sharpened in his field of vision. It was a woman, her features drawn with a mixture of professional focus and profound, quiet intensity. He blinked, the fog finally parting. He recognized the jawline, the set of the eyes, the reflection of a memory he had kept tucked away for 25 years.
Grace leaned forward, her expression shifting from observation to a soft, radiant smile. She reached out, her fingers resting lightly on the back of his hand.
The silence between them was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of a debt paid and a life returned. Thomas breathed in, the air feeling clearer than it had in years. He realized then that the circle had closed. He had saved a child, and now that child had stood by him to ensure his own story did not end in the dark. The news of the successful surgery did not stay confined to the recovery ward. It traveled through the hospital corridors, moving from nurses to administrators, and eventually to the local press. Grace stood at the center of this sudden attention, her decision firm. She gave the interview. She spoke of the debt,
the letter kept in the Bible, and the man who had traded his own future for hers 25 years ago.
The story broke by evening. It occupied screens in cafes, homes, and offices across the city. People who had never met Thomas Hale felt the weight of his sacrifice. In the comment sections and on street corners, the conversation shifted from the mechanics of the surgery to the nature of the act itself.
It was not just about a medical recovery. It was about the power of a stranger choosing to care.
The narrative of the warehouse worker who walked so a child could run became a template for empathy. Letters began arriving at the hospital, addressed to him, filled with stories of other small, hidden acts of grace.
The public response proved that kindness, once set into motion, does not simply vanish. It gathers strength, turning a solitary life into a beacon that reminds everyone watching that a single choice can change the world.
The hospital administrators moved quickly to ensure that Thomas's quiet heroism would not fade into the background of a busy ward. They selected a prominent wall in the main lobby, a space where thousands of patients and staff passed every day. Grace stood by as the maintenance crew measured the height, her eyes fixed on the final draft of the inscription.
It did not focus on wealth or status. It honored the act of giving without the expectation of return.
When the team finally secured the plaque, she stepped back to read the words. It was a simple statement about the power of an anonymous choice made on a Tuesday night. As the lobby grew busy with the morning shift, she watched people stop. They slowed their pace, leaned in, and read the text aloud. A doctor paused mid-stride. A young mother waiting for news looked up, her expression softening as she traced the lines of the tribute. The plaque changed the atmosphere of the room. It was no longer just a place of sterile transit. It became a site of reflection. By recognizing the legacy of one man, the hospital created a permanent reminder that the most profound human connections do not require recognition to hold their weight. Every person who stopped to look carried a piece of that story forward, ensuring the silence of his sacrifice would speak for generations to come. Back in his own home, the pace of life slowed to a different rhythm. Thomas spent his mornings in a chair by the window, his hands moving with deliberate care as he cleared a space on the wall. He reached into a small wooden box he had kept for decades. First, he took out the bank ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle, showing the exact date he had emptied his accounts. Beside it, he placed the letter from Linda, the ink still legible despite the passage of time. He laid them side by side on a flat surface,
aligning the edges with steady fingers. For a moment, he sat back, his breath hitching slightly as he looked at the two items.
They were the physical proof of a bridge built across 25 years. He secured them in place, the glass clicking into position. He hung the frame on the wall where the light caught the paper clearly. It was not a display for guests, but a private anchor. He stood back, his shoulders relaxing, and finally turned away from the past. The sacrifice that had defined his middle years had come full circle. He had given a future to a stranger, and in the end, that same stranger had returned the gift to him. The ledger and the letter now rested in silence, a permanent testament to a single, quiet choice. The cycles of our lives rarely resolve in neat, predictable patterns. They are often jagged, marked by sudden departures and long gaps of silence. Thomas and Grace proved that the most profound human connections are not those we plan or pursue,
but those that wait in the quiet corners of time. A single decision,
made in the sterile light of a hospital, held the power to alter the trajectory of two strangers for a quarter of a century. It is a reminder that kindness does not always require an immediate reward to be valid. It simply requires the courage to act when others look away. Grace continues her work, mending hearts.
While Thomas watches the sunlight shift across his wall, his own heart steady once more. They remain two separate lives,
forever tethered by a Tuesday night that neither could have anticipated. We move through our days unaware of the threads we pull or the burdens we lift for others. We do not see the consequences of our compassion until the moment is right. The story of the warehouse worker and the surgeon is not an anomaly. It is a testament to the hidden gravity that pulls us toward one another.
Some acts of grace do not fade.
They simply wait for the moment to return, proving that the most life-changing connections are the ones we never see coming.